The sun is directly overhead. The ground is so hot that if you tried to step on it barefoot, you'd get burned to a crisp. There's no shade around you, no buildings, no umbrellas, just you, your family, and the vast African sky. By noon, the air is practically shimmering. Heat waves rising in the distance blur the horizon. The only shade you can find is perhaps right next to a small rock, or waiting for evening to fall. But waiting isn't always an option. You need to find water, you need to hunt, you need to survive. In this landscape, nature doesn't give you a second chance. Now think about it. 300,000 years ago, the first modern humans began living right here, under this scorching African sun. Surrounded by lions, thirst, and hunger, survival was hard enough as it was. But there was one more danger. One that worked so slowly and silently that no one even noticed it. The sun itself. And one of the greatest secrets to their survival was something you might never have noticed. Their skin was dark. Dark skin wasn't a coincidence. It was the body's armor. Those invisible rays from the sun, what we call ultraviolet radiation, can damage the cells beneath your skin and even your DNA. Melanin, the dark pigment, acted like a sun umbrella, blocking that damage. Thanks to this, our dark-skinned ancestors were protected from both sunburn and something even worse, cancer. But there's another, lesser-known side to this story. Scientists discovered that the sun disrupts something else as well, folate. This vitamin, which is vital for our body's cell production and reproductive health, can be broken down by excessive ultraviolet light. So dark skin didn't just protect against sunburn, it also helped women conceive and give birth to healthy babies. At the equator, this was the difference between survival and extinction. So logically, everything should have been perfect, right? Dark skin does its job, people survive, and that's the end of the story. But it doesn't end there. In fact, for thousands of years, that's exactly how it seemed. Each new generation grew up under the same sun as the one before them, drank from the same rivers, and hunted the same animals. The world seemed unchanging. The sun rose in the morning, scorched at noon, and the cool of evening settled in. Children were born into this heat, grew into adults, and raised their own children under the same sky. This cycle, repeating generation after generation, seemed as if it would last forever.
That's exactly why nature wasn't in a hurry, because there was no reason for it to be. The body was already in harmony with its environment. Dark skin provided sufficient protection even during the sun's harshest hours, allowing people to raise healthy children and communities to sustain themselves. From an evolutionary perspective, it was hard to imagine a more successful outcome. This is precisely where the fascinating aspect of evolution lies. More often than not, change occurs not because a new advantage has emerged, but because an old advantage has begun to fall short. A trait can function flawlessly for millions of years, but the moment the environment changes, that same trait can suddenly become a liability. Nature doesn't plan this or make preparations in advance. It simply observes who is slightly more successful under the new conditions and gradually amplifies that small difference over thousands of generations. Humanity was approaching just such a turning point. No one was aware of it yet. They did not know that the path stretching out before them would change not only the lands they would inhabit, but also their very appearance. Because one day, those small human communities decided something. They began to walk. Out of Africa, north, east, into the unknown. Scientists believe this great migration began about 70,000 years ago, a journey spanning generations and crossing continents. And right here, that perfect armor that had ensured their survival suddenly began to pose a problem. Why? Because in the places they were heading, the sun wasn't as generous as it used to be. Imagine walking several thousand kilometers north. The air grows colder, the sky turns gray, and the sun is no longer directly overhead. It appears only faintly on the horizon. Some days it doesn't show up at all.
And without you even realizing it, your body slips into a silent crisis because your skin has another job.
using sunlight to produce vitamin D. When ultraviolet rays hit your skin, a chemical reaction begins that ultimately produces vitamin D. This vitamin is vital for absorbing calcium and keeping your bones strong. But dark skin blocks ultraviolet rays so effectively that in regions with little sunlight, it doesn't even let in the light your own body needs. In Africa, this was never a problem. There was more than enough sun, and blocking out the excess was actually an advantage. But now, in lands that are today's Scandinavia or Northern Europe, the sun is nowhere to be seen for most of the year. Even at noon in winter, the sky is a dim gray. The result? Bones are weakening, children are growing up with bowed legs, and women's hip bones aren't strong enough during childbirth. We call this condition rickets, and hard as it is to believe, it's not just a disease of the past. Even today, it's still seen in some communities that live far from the sun. Now think of Grug. He sits deep in the forest, beneath a gray winter sky. He isn't actually hungry. He's found game, built a fire, and is wrapped in furs. But his bones are slowly weakening in a way his ancestors never knew. Of course, Grug doesn't know why. He just feels that I'm not as strong as I used to be. And perhaps he attributes this to aging. And nature is doing what it's been doing for millions of years, quietly, slowly, searching for a solution across generations. Whoever is born with lighter skin grows up a little stronger, a little healthier, has a few more children. It sounds like a simple equation, doesn't it? Less sun calls for lighter skin. The solution should come immediately. But here's the strangest part. The solution didn't come as quickly as you'd think. In fact, far from coming quickly, it came incredibly late. So late, in fact, that scientists were shocked when they discovered it. In 2018, in England, scientists were studying a 10,000-year-old skeleton found in a cave called Cheddar Gorge. He was later given a name, Cheddar Man. Everyone assumed he would be fair-skinned and blue-eyed, just like modern-day Britons. After all, 10,000 years is a long time to have lived in Europe, isn't it? The Ice Age had ended, people had settled in these lands, and generations had come and gone. When the DNA results came in, everyone was stunned. Cheddar Man had dark skin, so dark it was almost black. His eyes, however, were blue. This discovery was so unexpected that when the news was announced, the news spread around the world. The ancestor of people living in England today who consider themselves native was a dark-skinned, blue-eyed man. Just think, it had been tens of thousands of years since humans left Africa and arrived in Europe. They were living in the cold of the Ice Age, under a gray sky, yet they still had dark skin. This discovery completely overturned the story that they turned white immediately to survive. So why did it take so long? If fair skin was such an advantage, why didn't nature hurry things along? The answer is far more interesting than you might imagine, because at that time, people's diet was still protecting them. Cheddar Man and other hunter-gatherers like him ate plenty of fish, wild game, offal, and liver. These foods were naturally rich in vitamin D. Fatty fish, like salmon in particular, contain incredible amounts of vitamin D. So they were getting the vitamin D they couldn't get from the sun, right from their plates. The pressure for skin color to change was still there, but it wasn't urgent. Nature isn't in a hurry. As long as a solution works, it doesn't need a new one. Then, something happened. Something that counts as one of the greatest transformations in human history, radically altering their way of life and shattering that old balance. Agriculture began. About 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, people in Europe stopped hunting and began cultivating the land. Wheat, barley, grains. This idea, which began in the Middle East, spread in waves northward and westward.
It sounds like progress, doesn't it? A safer, more predictable life. And in a way, it was. But there was a hidden cost, one that no one realized at the time. A grain-based diet contained far less vitamin D than fish and game meat. People were no longer hunting in the forests, they were working in the fields, which oddly enough could actually mean less exposure to the sun, since they were now living in crowded villages and shaded huts. So people were getting both less sunlight and less vitamin D from their diet. This moment, where the two losses overlapped, was precisely the critical threshold that nature had been waiting for. It was precisely at this point that the advantage of fair-skinned individuals came to the fore. They were able to produce enough vitamin D even from the limited, dim northern sunlight. They grew up healthier, their bones were stronger, women gave birth more safely, they had more children, and those children survived. This small advantage grew exponentially over generations. Scientists trace this to a gene called SLC24A5, one of the main factors behind fair skin. This single genetic variation alone can have a surprisingly large effect on skin color. And looking at genetic data, it was found that this gene spread across Europe at nearly the same pace and along the same routes as the spread of agriculture. So the real truth is this: it wasn't direct sunlight that made people white, it was bread. Strange but true, as our ancestors transitioned to a more civilized way of life, their bodies had to adapt by changing their skin color. In a sense, civilization created its own evolutionary pressure. Think about Grug again. He no longer hunts. He grows wheat in a small field and lives in a village with his neighbors. He's well fed, but his bones are still frail and his joints ache in the winter. And his great-great-grandchildren, hundreds of generations later, will be born with much fairer skin that requires far less sunlight. This wasn't evolution at the speed of light, but it was still surprisingly rapid, one of the most visible physical changes in human history. Today, we still bear the traces of this story. People living in northern countries are still advised to take vitamin D supplements because the sun is still scarce there. The lives we lead in offices and indoors recreate in a different way the very same problem our ancestors faced thousands of years ago, being cut off from the sun. And perhaps the most striking part is this: the diversity of skin colors around the world is not a difference to be fought over. Different responses from the same species to the same sun and the same challenges. Dark skin was a shield against the equatorial sun. Light skin was a survival strategy under the dim skies of the north. Both were striving for the same thing: to survive, to reproduce, to carry on. The fact that Cheddar Man with his dark skin lived in Europe reminds us that what we call race is an extremely new and extremely fragile concept in the long flow of human history. Thousands of years ago, the people we see as so different from one another today all came from the same ancestor under the same African sun. Maybe the next time you spend a little too long in the sun and your skin gets sunburned, or when you feel sluggish in the winter and suspect a vitamin D deficiency, think of Grug in that cold forest, because the puzzle his body was trying to solve tens of thousands of years ago is still quietly unfolding in your body every single day. Anyway, there are still thousands of stories from human history waiting to be told on that wall. And with every video, we're adding a new one to that cave wall. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you at the cave wall.